Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to day 6 of Cycle 2015. I'm very happy and honored to have my friend Mary Ruwart with us today. She's one of those warm-hearted libertarians, not those cold-hearted, hate-the-poor type libertarians. Of course, there really aren't any of those, but we're often confused, and Mary is one of the few people in the world who just excels at bridging that gap. She's a person of warm smiles, as you can see, and warm hugs, and she wrote a wonderfully warm book called Healing Our World. And there's a new version of that, and I hope she'll talk to us a little bit about that because it's a fantastic resource for people who get these questions from non-libertarians who don't get it, and they say, well, aren't you, what about the poor, and aren't you being cold-hearted? Mary has many other credits to her name, but I won't steal her thunder. Let's go ahead and turn the show over to Mary. Thank you for joining us, Mary.
Well, thank you, Lobo. And I have to say, I'm really pleased to be here, and I want to thank the groups who are sponsoring this, Liberty.me, who's been very helpful, and of course the International Society for Individual Liberty, of which I am chair. And I wanted to get you excited about both these organizations because they really are doing a lot for the cause. And of course, as you listen to these different talks, you'll realize how much. And my talk today is entitled Political Freedom, or you could say Political Liberty, a matter of life and death. And you might wonder, well, wait a minute, freedom's important and everything, but is it really a matter of life and death? And I'm here to tell you, yes, it is. And I'm here to tell you why. So I'd like to start by getting back to basics and talking about what political freedom or liberty really is, because there's a lot of misconceptions about it. Some people think that political liberty or freedom is the ability to do anything you want to do. And that's just not right. But the way to explain it, maybe, would be to share with you some material on the non-aggression principle, which is the foundation of libertarianism and what I call the good neighbor policy. So let's take a look at that. And I'm trying to go ahead and get my slides going, and they're not moving. So I am going to have to do this a little differently, I think. I'm sorry for the interruption here. We'll just, there we go. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the non-aggression principle, and I'm going to go back and forth between my slides and myself, so you don't need to worry that you've lost me here. But the non-aggression principle is something, that we use when we're interacting as neighbors on a one-to-one basis. We don't threaten, first strike, physical force, fraud, or theft against each other. No, we honor our neighbor's choice.
Sorry,
and
Mary.
Yes.
Mary, I got to jump in. Sorry. You are sharing slides right now.
Oh, you're not seeing them. This is not good. Okay, there we go. Let's make.
Okay. To the left.
Okay, there we go.
Okay,
Thank you.
okay.
I had a little bit of trouble in the beginning, so I think I maybe didn't quite do this right. So, anyway, if, for example, we're living side by side and we violate that principle, we make things right again. So, for example, if I'm your neighbor and I'm outside playing ball and I throw something through your window and break it, by accident, of course, I'd come over to you and say, oops, I broke your window, let me replace it. And if I did that, we'd still be friends. But what if I didn't do it? What if I said, hey, too bad for you? You'd be very upset with me, and rightly so. And we'd be feuding. So that wouldn't be a good thing. Now, even though we understand this on a one-to-one basis and we practice it, we sometimes don't do it when we're interacting group to group. For example, let me get, there we go. For example, if we're interacting group to group and I want to build a park, for example, and I come to you and say, hey, would you donate to this park? Then you could use it too. And you might say, nah, I don't think so. It's not what I want to do. Well, if we were being good neighbors, I would say to you, okay, well, maybe my next project you'll be interested in. But that's not what we do when we're talking about parks or helping the poor or things like that. What we do is we go to our government and we say, hey, you know, my neighbor won't donate to this project. Will you make sure you force them to do so? And the way we do that is we vote. We vote that there's going to be a tax, and then if you don't pay the tax for the park, someone will come and take your property away. And of course, this engenders a lot of resentment on your part if you're never going to use the park. So when it's time to do your project, which might be a library, if I don't want to donate to it, you go to the government and ask them to intercede and take my money on your behalf. And so we take turns being aggressors and victims, majorities and minorities. And, you know, that creates some ill will between groups. So we don't even realize it, but that's how we violate the non-aggression principle or good neighbor policy through government. So because of that, what we find is that, and I'm sorry, I'm still having trouble. There we go. What we find is that political freedom is really freedom from aggression through government. In other words, if we have freedom or liberty, we aren't able to use government to force our neighbors to our will, to bend them to our will. And as long as we have that, then we're good neighbors, and we're helping each other out, and we're not engendering this negativity towards each other, not getting into these feuds, not feeling like, oh, you know, I'm one group and they're another, not having that type of thing going on. So let's talk about some examples of this. For example, if, you know, one of the things that happens with this aggression through government is government favors certain groups to do certain occupations. In Europe, in the late 1700s, for example, you had to sometimes get permission to practice your trade from a guild. If you weren't part of the guild, then you were not allowed to practice. And so the U.S. had a lot of immigration from Europe because people wanted to be able to create wealth for themselves and their loved ones, and they weren't allowed to in Europe. But in the U.S. at that time, there were no restrictions on that. So they could come to the U.S. and they could have the job of their choice, the profession of their choice, without having to go back to the guilds. Now, this is very important because that's how the idea that political freedom means freedom to do what you want came about. If you think about it for a moment, most of the things we want to do that are stopped through aggression by government are pretty important things. We want to create wealth so we can put food on the table for our family, for example. And if government prevents that, then that's not what we want to do. And so that's how the idea of freedom to do what you want got meshed, so to speak, with the idea of political liberty or freedom, even though they really aren't the same things. It just happens that when we have political freedom, we are usually able to do much more of what we want to do. So, given that, how does political freedom or liberty relate to life and death? Well, if you go ahead and look at the difference in the per capita income in countries with more freedom, what you see, as shown on this graph, is that the amount of gross domestic product, or GDP per capita, that a country has is much higher if they're in one of the free countries than if they're one of the least free countries. And if you're not familiar with this type of data from the Fraser Institute, they publish it every year. It's called Economic Freedom of the World at freetheworld.com. I highly suggest you go there and check it out because it's a great, great resource. And what you can see here, for example, is that in the freest countries, the GDP per capita is about $36,000 a year. We're in the least free countries, it's not even $5,000 a year. Well, that's a pretty big discrepancy. Of course, some people say, well, yeah, but how about the poor? Well, actually, as you can see from this graph, which is very similar to the last one, in the freest countries, the poor have more. This graph shows the income of the poorest 10% versus the economic freedom. And as you can see, in the freest countries, the average poor person is living on about $10,000 US a year, whereas the least free don't even have $1,000 a year. It's quite a difference. And if you crank the numbers, what you see is that the poor suffer the most. In other words, when you have less freedom, the poor actually have less than they do in a country with more freedom. So that actually the distribution of wealth is actually it's actually better for the poor. And you know this intuitively. And the reason you do is think about it. Would you rather be a poor person in India, for example, or a poor person in the U.S.? And intuitively, you just know that you're going to do better in the U.S. So it's not rocket science. Now, most of the time, the world has been poor. And to see that, we'll go to the next slide. And what you'll see is that the GNP, the gross national product, very similar to the gross domestic product per capita, was pretty low in the early years, up until about, the 1780s. And in fact, if I extended that line back 2,000 years, it'd be about the same. In other words, the world was poor for most of the time of humankind's existence. It was only in the 1780s that things seemed to change. Now, you might ask, what changed there? And of course, you might remember the Industrial Revolution. If you read most history books, they kind of talk about it as sort of an accident in history, but it was no accident. At that point in time, the U.S. was founded, and it was much more free than any country had ever been up to that time. The largest country, I should say. There probably were small examples before that. And actually, Britain, which lost its American colonies, changed the way it operated about that time, too. It changed the laws. It stopped being quite so aggressive to its own British citizens. And so the U.S. and Britain were the foundation of the Industrial Revolution, and Europe decided it would copy what was happening in the U.S. and Britain. So, as you recall, that was a time when a lot of the monarchies fell, and a lot more freedom was established in various countries in Europe. So they joined the Industrial Revolution, and they became what is known today as the developed countries. Now, the third world, or the countries that remain poor, didn't join in this revolution. They didn't become freer, and so they stayed back where they had been for most of history. And that's pretty sad. So, and again, what does that have to do? What does wealth have to do with life and death? And what we want to show is that it's actually very important, because if you look at the life expectancy that we have in years and relate it to our annual income, it's very clear that the more money we have enables us to have a longer life expectancy, which makes sense because, after all, you can afford medicine, you can afford good nutritional food, so it makes total sense. So wealth isn't just about having fancy cars or fancy houses. It's literally a matter of life and death. And since freedom is what helps you create wealth, it also is a matter of life and death. Now, you might want to find out and ask, well, wait a minute. Okay, so how does freedom work that way? How does it help create wealth? Well, if we look at the next slide, we can kind of get an idea of this. Now, the black line, the heavy black line, shows the number of federal regulators in the United States from the 1980s to the 1990s. And as you see, there was a big dip during the Reagan years. That was one thing he did right. He got rid of a lot of regulators. And notice that the gray line, which is private sector job growth, increased as the regulators decreased. And when regulators started being rehired in the late 1980s, the number of private sector jobs in the U.S. dropped off. Well, what does this tell us? First of all, it tells us that for every regulator that was fired, about 150 private sector jobs were created. And that's because regulators actually destroy jobs. And if your job is destroyed, you're not creating any wealth for your family, right? So if you're not creating wealth for your family, that's a problem. Let me give you a real-life example of how these regulations work. I actually rented property to low-income tenants for a long time, and I had two women that were making ends meet, creating wealth for themselves and their family through their own businesses. One went to stores in the area and measured their windows, came back to her apartment and made curtains. The other lady took in the children of people in the neighboring apartments while the parents went to work. So she did childcare in the apartments. One day I got a call from the city government and they said, "We want you to evict these women." And I said, "Why should I do that?" "Well, they have businesses in the apartments. The apartments are not zoned commercial, so they shouldn't be there. And neither of them have business licenses. And even if they applied, well, we certainly wouldn't give one to the child care lady because the height of the ceiling in the apartment isn't high enough." And I said, "Well, I'm not going to evict them. They don't create any new traffic. It's not a problem for me. And the children that you're worried about don't have high enough ceilings in that apartment. They live in identical apartments with their parents. It doesn't make any sense." Well, I wouldn't evict them, but the city government didn't give up. It kept hounding them and hounding them. And finally, the women said, "You know, we can't take this anymore. These people are just making our lives miserable, so we're going to quit our jobs and go on welfare." And you know, that's exactly what the city government wanted. When I had asked them, "What are these women going to do if, you know, you put them out of business?" And they said, "Oh, well, they'll go on welfare like they should." This is crazy. Here these women are supporting themselves and they're basically being told that they shouldn't do it. It's crazy. But that's regulators for you. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, wait a minute. Some of these regulations are for consumer protection. They're for our own good, right? So shouldn't we get excited about these and want these? Well, you know, everybody assumes that if you pass regulations to protect yourselves, that's actually what happens. But in fact, the opposite occurs. And that's partly because when we use aggression as our means, we don't get the ends we want, because aggression, as we talked about earlier, creates feuding. It costs money. And so the unintended consequences are just the opposite of what we want. Let me give you some examples. One researcher decided that he was going to write a paper about how well regulations worked. And he got a big surprise because he found out they didn't. What he did is he used the electrician licensing laws, the licensing laws for dentists, and the licensing laws for optometrists, and studied them in the 50 states of the United States. And you know, it's like, because these regulations are statewide as opposed to federal, every state has a different set of regulations. So you can compare all 50 states and see which states are the safest. Well, when he did that, he was shocked, because what he found was that there were more accidental electrocutions in the states that had more stringent licensing laws for electricians. And in states that had more rigorous licensing laws for dentists, dental hygiene was poorer. In the states that had more stringent regulations for optometrists, there was more blindness. Well, obviously, this was shocking to the researcher, but he published his research and his conclusion, which was that when you have licensing laws, what happens is that you have fewer service providers, because not everyone can afford to go to school for as many years as they have to go to. They can't afford to apprentice at low pay, and they just can't take the time off when they're not making money, because they have to feed their family, so they go do something else. So there are fewer electricians, fewer dentists, and fewer optometrists. What happens when there's fewer service providers is the few that make it through the regulatory red tape are able to charge more. And because they're charging more, their service is not affordable to some people. For example, if you have an electrical problem, but the electrician is very expensive, you may do without that repair, or you might try to do it yourself, and you may get electrocuted in the process. So laws that are meant to protect us often don't. And if you look at what regulations actually are, they are rules that say government is going to force you to only use the service providers that we say are okay. If you try to use a different service provider, we're going to stop you. And we're going to stop that service provider. We are going to throw that person in jail. We're going to fine them. We're going to hurt them in some other way. You, the consumer, don't get to make the decision. The government does, and it does it with the force of law, which is virtually at gunpoint, if necessary. So that's what's actually happening. So aggression is giving us ends that we'd rather not have. Just because we make a law, it doesn't mean it makes it so. Now, I'm very familiar with this because I actually work in a field where that is very crucial, and that is in the drug industry, the pharmaceutical industry. I'm currently writing a book about the things I'm going to tell you now. Basically, many of you may remember that back in the early 60s, there was a drug called thalidomide that created problems in the unborn babies. They basically were born without some of their limbs. And as a result of that tragedy, which was the greatest drug disaster in history up to that time, there was a feeling that more regulation or consumer protection legislation was needed. Now, as you can see from the slide that I have up, before these regulations were passed in 1962, it took about 4 years for a drug to get from the lab bench to the marketplace. But as you can see from the reddish bars, after these regulations were passed, the time it took a drug to get to market increased to about 14 years. And that's really a long time, especially if you're dying. You know, I was working on AIDS research back when, you know, it first reared its head there in the late 80s, early 90s. And what we found is that the AIDS patients couldn't wait those 14 years. You know, they were dying too fast. So what they did is they went to the black market. They hired chemists to make the drugs we were working on. And by the time the FDA gave us permission to put our drugs in people and test them, the entire AIDS community had our drug and were resistant to it. So that's what happens when you have a long development time. And it didn't make the drugs any safer, because most drugs that get to market and are shown to have side effects have problems that can't be detected by animal work and can't be detected in small numbers of people. You know, we're all different genetically, and sometimes what we eat influences how the drug acts too. So you don't see those problems oftentimes in the early clinical studies that you do in order to test your drug. It's only when it gets out on the market and is taken by many people that these problems arise. And so since that's the major reason, you don't get any more safety by adding all these regulations. And another thing is that even though the AIDS patients acted illegally, for the most part, the government let them alone. It was afraid of the public backlash it would get. But there were some individuals that had problems. If you saw the award-winning movie Dallas Buyers Club, which was, highly regarded by the critics, what you saw is an individual who was having a buyers club being taken down by the FDA and threatened with prison because he was trying to distribute vitamins and drugs that weren't available in the United States to dying people. Now, as you might imagine, AIDS patients aren't the only ones who die waiting. Cancer patients do too. And the cancer patients didn't want to go the route that the AIDS patients went. They wanted to be legal. So they sued the FDA in court. And the courts determined that Americans do not have the right to try to save their lives with unapproved drugs. So once again, they don't have the political freedom or liberty to take what they want when they want it in an attempt to save their life. The government dictates what they can take and what they can try to save their lives. So truly, once again, this is a matter of life and death. And it's not just happening in the US. Since most drugs are made in America, what happens here ripples outward and influences the entire world. So these are some of the reasons that, we say that liberty is truly a matter of life and death. And if you watch John Stossel, you might have seen a program years ago where he went and tried to open a Frisbee business in India, Hong Kong, and New York City. In Hong Kong, it took him a few hours to get all the permits. In New York City, it took him several weeks. But in India, it was going to be 5 years and no guarantee that he'd ever be able to open his business. What poor person can wait 5 years to get permits to do their business? They can't. And that's why most of the business in the developing world is done in the black market. It's very sad. But there's another reason that the developing world has problems that's related to this government aggression that we've been talking about, and that is property rights. In the US, the Western territories were settled by people who came from the East, put down the markers on the property for their farm, and in the US, that was recognized as a way to claim the property. When the individuals took the boundaries of the property, the little map, to the registration desk at the government, they accepted that. And so you could homestead property in the US. This hasn't happened as well as it should in the developing world. People live on the property as if they're homesteading it, but the government still owns it, and sometimes they drive people off. So naturally, people aren't going to put a good home there. They're not going to do things to keep the ground fertile, because if they do, they could lose it the next day. And so one of the things I want to share with you is how libertarians are coming to the rescue. So let me go ahead and show you the next slide. This is a screenshot from an article on the International Society for Individual Liberties website, isil.org. And what we're doing is we have a donation page here, and an explanation, of course, of what the project is, where people can go and try to help people in India get their property rights. One of our ISIL members, Baru Mitra, is heading up this project, and what he's doing is getting funds to get GPS units for every village, and the village takes that GPS unit and shares it among the villagers so they can map out the boundaries of their property. When they're all agreed what the boundaries are, they can then file papers with the government. It's a process. It takes a little while, but with some help, they're able to do that. And when they do, they actually end up truly owning the property free and clear, just like we would in Western nations. And what's wonderful about that is overnight they go from being paupers to being landowners. And now they can build on the property. They can sell it. They can mortgage it. You know, they have the beginnings of something that they can use to establish their own business. It's really wonderful. So I hope that you will visit the ISIL page, and I hope you'll join us in efforts like this. And if you have something going on in your country like this, please send it to us. We might be able to help promote it for you. And if you want to learn more about this idea of homesteading, and this concept that I'm talking about isn't familiar to you, I highly recommend Hernando de Soto's book called The Mystery of Capital. He really brought this to the attention of the developed world, and I think it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. Now, I've been talking about how bad government can be and how it can really destroy our wealth and our health. But I'm sure you're wondering, is there something we can do about it? And that's what I want to talk to you about next. So let me go to my next slide. And this slide basically shows that yes, you can do something about it, and you can do something about it quickly. This slide shows that Ireland, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom had several different kind of periods in their history. In recent times now, I'm talking about the 20th century here, where they had high government spending and low government spending. Because what happened when they had high government spending, they got in big trouble. You know, they were in debt, they ran out of money, and they said, oh, this is terrible. We're going to have to cut spending, cut taxes, cut tariffs. You know, basically they went from very aggressive governments to less aggressive governments. And look what happened. In the period of low spending, their wealth creation, which was measured as the annual growth rate of the GDP, went from a couple percent to almost double that. It's fantastic, and it happened, I don't want to say overnight, but it was pretty close. It really happened within a few years. So the good news is that even if you live in a country that has a lot of aggression through government, a lot of the problems I've described today, a government that destroys the opportunity for you to create wealth and compromises your health, there is a way to turn it around, and it happens quickly. Now, you might be asking, but wait a minute, you're talking about countries that already were developed. What about a country that's really, really poor? Can it do this too? And the answer is yes. You know, 50 years ago, Hong Kong was a rock sitting by the side of the ocean with virtually no resources. You know, it doesn't have any oil. It even didn't have really enough fresh water to support its population. And because it really had virtually no aggression through government, and is still today considered to be the freest region in the world, within 50 years, it was able to get a per capita income that rivaled that of the United States in the mid-90s. That's pretty impressive. So if Hong Kong can do it with virtually no resources, open immigration, you know, really, and of course it was a colony at the time. It was a British colony. The Brits just said, we're not going to do anything. You guys kind of do what you want. And it worked out beautifully because Hong Kong didn't want to have aggression through government. And so it grew wealthy. And if Hong Kong can do it, then your country can too. So even though aggression through government can be very nasty and it can take away wealth and take away health, there is a solution, and it can happen fast. So I want to give you that ray of hope. Now, I'm sure some of you are wondering, well, wait a minute. Now, some government spending can be good, right? I mean, education, health. Well, unfortunately, that's not the way the world works. So let me get back to my PowerPoint and show you this. Okay, so this is a slide that shows that when government spending increases, government spending as a percentage of the total wealth that a country creates, when the government is spending most of that, the growth rate of wealth in the country plunges. And that's because even with good intentions, government just doesn't know how to do things right, shall we say. And it's not that people aren't good intentioned in government, but if you think about how things happen, you can understand it. Because first of all, before government can do anything, before it can spend anything, it has to first take it from the people who earn it. And the people who earn it don't want to give it up, so they hide it, don't report it. So the government has to spend a considerable amount of money getting those taxes, for example. And then, of course, what happens is government has to enforce the laws that of whatever it's doing. So, for example, if it's forcing everyone to go to government schools, that takes some enforcement. You know, that takes the truant officers. That means it has to pay teachers and, you know, do all these things. And it really has no way of judging if it's doing a good job because it doesn't have profit. You know, profit in the private sector signals the business people that they're doing a good job or they're doing a bad job. If they're not making money, it means they're doing a bad job. It means that people aren't willing to pay for their service, at least not as much as they're charging. The government doesn't have that feedback. So even if it tries to do the right thing, it's very, very difficult. So government's inefficient, and part of the reason it's inefficient is that, if you think in terms of regulation, for example, most people who are electricians, for example, wouldn't go and try to fix your electricity without pretty much knowing what should be done. Now, there'll be a few, of course, that will, but most people don't want to fuss with electricity unless they know what they're doing. So government spends a lot of time and energy trying to regulate and test and worry about a group of people where most of them are going to do the right thing. So it spends a lot of money messing with the good people in order to hope that it'll be able to find the bad people and do something about them. But if you think about it, wouldn't it be more efficient just to go after the bad people? Of course it would. It would make much more sense. And there's ways in the marketplace to do that. So when we have regulation, for example, we are simply wasting our money. And we're wasting a lot of it because we're trying to control people who don't need to be controlled, but still have to be put through the process. Okay, so where does that leave us? Well, I want to talk to you about kind of sum things up a little bit here. So if we had political freedom, we'd be about 3 to 8 times wealthier. You're probably wondering where I got that number. Well, there's many studies out there that show the impact of government aggression and how much it costs us. And so depending on which one of those studies you look at, you can see that somewhere in this range is what we could have. And I'm including the developed countries in this because the developed countries don't have perfect freedom either. I've given you some examples in the US just to show you. But of course in the developing world, the number is probably at the high end because, you know, there's been so much government aggression that the potential just hasn't been reached. And of course there'll be jobs for virtually everyone because if you think about it, if government isn't there preventing the creation of jobs, if it's not there preventing people from working at whatever capacity, large or small, that they can, everybody can find a niche. You know, even if you're cleaning houses for a couple people a week or something, I mean, things, you know, there's a job there for you. It might not be paying as much as you would like to get, but once you start getting some experience, then you can get recommendations, you can get training, and you can move to a higher level. So getting started is extremely important, and that's what these regulations prevent people from doing. And if you think about the things I've said, it should be pretty obvious that poverty as we know it today would be obsolete if we ended aggression through government. You know, that's something really big, because we have about 1 out of 9 people on the globe right now who die of malnutrition or the effects of malnutrition, like getting infections easily that they can't fight off. Half of the infant deaths are thought to be due to malnutrition in some form. This is just not necessary anymore. We have the technology, and everyone can be well fed, everyone can be wealthy if government would just get out of the way. And of course, I showed you a slide with life expectancy, and the difference between the developed, the most highly, let's just say the freest nations and the least free nations was about 20 years. And so the nations there at the bottom can easily get 20 years. I think even the nations that have the highest life expectancy today might expect another 20 years as well, because there's still some aggression through government that, if it were gone, would allow us to have more wealth, more medicine, etc. So, you know, basically what I'm saying is less liberty is less life. And that's something that's really important, because living, obviously, is what we want to do. It's truly a matter of life and death. Now today I focused on wealth and health, but there's just one more aspect I want to talk about, and that is happiness. Does wealth and health give you happiness? Well, I think most of us recognize that it might not in its entirety, but it helps. And I want to relate what I've said today to our own personal happiness, because there's something I learned that I wanted to share with you. I once had the opportunity to talk to a gentleman here in the U.S. who was helping the government sell its programs and encouraging people to vote and accept things that were against their own best self-interests. He had studied a lot of psychology, so he could kind of market the idea of all these government aggressions as something that was good instead of something that was bad and harmful. I asked him what his goals in life were, and he said power and money. But of course he already had power and money, and I realized I had asked him the wrong question. So I said to him instead, I said, what do you think would make you happy? What would it take? Because he didn't seem very happy to me. And he paused for a moment. And then he said, well, I think if I wanted to be happy, I would need to feel connected to humankind. And you know, I don't. And it took me years to really understand the implications of this. This person basically lied to the American public, and from what he told me, he was not honest with in his personal relationships either. And it occurred to me that as human beings, we're constructed to need a certain level of goodwill towards each other. You know, we're social creatures, and so almost built into our genetics, I think, is a sense of needing a connection with our fellow humans. And this man didn't have it, because if you think about what he did, before you can deceive someone, which he was doing, you have to judge them as less than yourself, as stupider than you are, as unable to take the truth, as somebody to be exploited, In other words, you don't regard them with the same love, and I use that in a very universal love way, that same love that you have for yourself. In other words, you don't regard them as highly as you do yourself. So of course you're not connected to them because you've disconnected yourself before you can deceive them, before you can aggress against them. And I suspect that our personal happiness depends somewhat on not only connecting with humankind, but by that I mean having goodwill towards humankind, to the others around us, to being happy about giving them their freedom and not trying to control them. Because when we try to control others, we do it because we think they're bad people who are going to hurt us, or they're stupid people who are going to make the wrong decisions or something like that. And so we separate ourselves from them. And in doing that, in trying to get our happiness by controlling others, we actually throw it out the window immediately. So just a theory I'm proposing that, yes, political liberty is a matter of life and death. And our willingness to grant it to others, well, it's a prerequisite for our happiness, our own personal happiness. I'd like to end today, as Lobo suggested, with just once again thanking the International Society for Individual Liberty and Liberty.me for sponsoring this, and showing you one final slide. I'm giving you my website and ISIL's website, and I should have put Liberty.me on here as well, Liberty.me. And if you're interested in learning more about these things, please go to my website and look at Healing Our World, The Compassion of Libertarianism, How to Enrich the Poor, Protect the Environment, Deter Crime, and Diffuse Terrorism. Or check out Short Answers to the Tough Questions. How to answer the questions libertarians are often asked in sound bites. Now, some of this material is actually in my free library, so you don't have to necessarily buy something in order to get a lot of this information. And of course, if you want to learn more about ISIL and join it, and I hope you will, please do so, because we have so many interesting projects, and who knows, we might be able to help you with yours. So I'm going to end my talk and just say once again, political freedom or political liberty, it's a matter of life and death. I'll take your questions. Thank you.
Yay. That was very good, Mary. Those slides were few and to the point, and thank you for going back and forth so we could see you. Very emotional, and that's a good thing. I'm familiar with everything you said, but I felt something listening to you and seeing your face when you pause and you think about what it means to go from 4 years to 14 years. And, that's strong stuff. We do have some questions here, and the first two are exactly what you would expect. You can take them whichever way you want. The first one is sort of like, well, the anti-side, what do you tell people who say that we have to have some regulations, otherwise, businesses would compromise safety in pursuit of profits, like the airlines, they might use cheaper metals or something, the airplanes might fall apart more, and so on.
Yes. Well, the marketplace actually regulates that pretty good. In fact, the marketplace is a stricter regulator than government, and that's because if an airline uses faulty materials and has lots of crashes, nobody is going to fly that airline. It will only take 1 or 2 crashes. In fact, if you look after every airline crash that's, unless they're shot down by terrorists. If there's some kind of fault of the airline, the stock plunges. There's a lot of disincentive for airlines or any other company to put out a faulty product. Now, what's interesting in the drug industry is brand name used to be what sold a drug. I remember those times. But once the FDA got its claws, so to speak, in the 62 amendments, things changed. Now, if it's FDA approved, it's assumed to be safe and effective, which is another problem altogether. It's not necessarily so. And actually, it's so what's happened is the pharmaceutical companies have a disincentive to try to be ethical because that doesn't count anymore. So the marketplace regulation is actually what you want. And for tough things like drugs, doctors, things like that, you can have certifications, which means that some group, professional group, looks at these drugs or the doctors, gives them their seal of approval, and then you, as a discerning consumer, can only go to those people if that's the way you want to work. But if you're dying of a terminal illness, you know, you might want to take a drug that hasn't gotten a seal of approval yet because it might be your only chance. So you have the choice, not a bureaucrat in Washington or any other world capital.
Good answer. And you didn't say, but of course the government standards also protect the wrongdoers or the shoddy work. Because if you can show that you met the minimal government standards, you're not, you know, it's not your fault. You met the standard.
Right. That is definitely a defense, yes.
Okay, the other question, the flip side of that is, what do we do about all this over-regulation in America, or, you know, the EU with its famous phone book size regulations on everything?
Yes.
How do we begin to roll that back?
Well, of course, one of the biggest things is we have to explain to our public, be they in the U.S. or elsewhere, that regulations backfire every time. And that's a large part of what Healing Our World is about. So if you want detail, that's where you can go. Now, the other thing is that you can do things as individuals or small groups. For example, in the U.S., there's a group of lawyers called the Institute for Justice. And what it does is it goes and finds these people who are persecuted by government. For example, African-American hair braiders who are told they need a cosmetology license to braid hair. And of course, if they even got that license, they'd never be taught to braid hair, so it makes no sense at all. But anyhow, they take these cases and they go to court and they show the court that, hey, this isn't about safety for the consumer. This is about protecting the people who are already doing it. It's protecting the cosmetologists. And so what's happened is they've been so successful. They've been to the Supreme Court a couple times, and they haven't always won, but they've always been successful in getting their point across. So I really recommend checking them out, ij.org, the Institute for Justice, ij.org. There's no reason that you couldn't have something similar in every country.
There's a business opportunity, maybe not a for-profit business opportunity, but there's an idea for entrepreneurial people in other countries. Every country should have an IJ. I like that idea. They're one of my favorite groups. I mean, anybody that takes on Leviathan directly like that, you know, you got to tip your hat at least in that direction. A follow-on question to that was, what about voting with your feet? Is that an option, or is everywhere in the world over-regulated? Does it help? You know, what can you do?
Well, I think, again, you could go to Hong Kong or some other place that doesn't have as many regulations, and that's an individual choice. You know, everybody has to kind of do what they do. I'm staying here in the U.S. because I want to change things here. So that's my thing. It just depends on where you're coming from and what you need to do. If you're a young person and there's a particular type of business you want to do that you can't do in your country, it might be worth it to move.
We have another question. One of our people wants to know, how is it possible that they teach in history that Roosevelt saved the United States from the Great Depression, even though all he did was implement massive new government programs and regulations that you're talking about which kill people?
Well, this is part of what the propaganda that I was talking about at the very end. There are spin masters who do nothing but try to create the illusion that we need more government. So this is something that, this is an example of that. And what happened initially, at least in the U.S., is people fell for it. Because what happened in the early 20th century is the propaganda was, oh, freedom's a good thing, but you know, it really doesn't take care of the poor, it doesn't protect the consumer, it doesn't protect the environment. And people fell for it because there was, you know, there were no studies that showed differently. Today, there are so many studies that show differently. I could not reference them all in Healing Our World. When I first put it out in 1992, I probably hit 80% of the literature that was out there. I don't even think I got half of it this time. It's just so much there showing that things are not what we've been told. So the good news is with the internet, you have access to all that. So you have access to all the intellectual ammunition you need. And there is a lot out there.
It's good to have the truth on our side. It does matter. That's terrific. One of our viewers wants to know if you've heard of the work of R.J. Rummel.
That name sounds familiar, but I'm not picking up on what he did. Could you put it in the chat box? I can see the chat box.
Yeah, well, I'd have to look for a link, and I don't think we have time because it's already 5 minutes until the next show. So we're going to need to step out of harm's way here. But we'll Google it, and if Mary, if you have thoughts to share, I can post them in the discussion list later, or you could join us there.
Okay.
But we do need to clear the airwaves here to get ready for our next speaker. So I want to thank you for a terrific talk. A little bit of technical glitches at the beginning, but once we got going there, some great charts and classic Mary Ruwart delivery. I mean, it was wonderful, and I appreciate you taking the time to join us, and look forward to seeing you around soon.
Yes, and if anyone has further questions, they can just go to my website and send them to me there, and I'll try to answer them. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much. All right, have a good day, afternoon, wherever you are.
Yes. Bye-bye.